I have only worked on one question my entire life, which has now been almost 35 years. And that question is really simply stated, which is, why do not most organizations use the tools and processes that we would all agree are good things to do? Okay? In the 90s, when I was working on my dissertation, that sentence comes out of my mouth a little rough, but I studied this problem in manufacturing and product development, where people were struggling to use the lean tools and the quality management tools and the new product development tools. And the basic finding from my work and that of many other people is exactly as you described, which is there would be big change initiatives. People would get started with using these tools. There'd be a burst of enthusiasm, often accompanied by T-shirts and coffee mugs and posters and offsites. And then 6 months later or 12 months later, when my students and I would go back, there would be essentially no impact. Okay? A little bit later in my career, actually, I moved from kind of the manufacturing product development world into the world of high hazard, largely in the oil and gas industry. And there, I have to say, I was not prepared for how acute this problem is in that particular space. The photo I have up here is from an incident that happened in BP's Texas City refinery in March of 2005. That used to be a processing unit. It was entirely flattened. The explosion that flattened it killed 15 people, had 200 injuries, was at the time the worst industrial accident in the United States in more than 20 years. BP would replace that 5 years later, sadly, with the accident in the Gulf of Mexico. And what was so shocking to me, as someone who helped a little bit investigate this, is this incident could have been stopped at either 7 or 8 different junctures, depending on how you count. Okay? And none of these was fancy technology. Okay? The basics required to run an oil refinery safely, a drilling rig safely, a nuclear power plant safely, a hospital safely, are all well known, right? BP had some of the world's experts in process safety on their staff, actually largely from Amoco, one of the companies that they had acquired, and yet could not manage to sort of commit and use those practices on a day-to-day basis, right? That is very hard as an academic to understand. And I'm imagining that your organization has a very similar dilemma. You probably don't have the risk profile that you do if you have an oil refinery, but getting organizations to use best practices turns out to be much harder than it looks. And that is really the question that I've worked on for the bulk of my career. And the book is really my attempt, or Don's and my attempt, at answering that question, both with the diagnosis and we hope with some tools that can help you avoid that pathology going forward. The backstory here is the client in this case, or actually not even client, just the partner, Standard Chartered Bank. If you're from North America, you may never have heard of them. They're a UK-based bank. They do a lot of work in Africa, in the Middle East. And many years ago, their chief operating officer, David Whiting, took one of our early dynamic work design classes and became, quite enamored with the stuff that we did. And in his role as COO, one of the things he was responsible for was in their IT development process, the COO's office had to approve each IT project for risk, right? So they had to make sure that a new app was consistent with their cybersecurity protocols, with their risk protocol, data security, and so on and so forth. So they had to basically look at every project that came through the pipeline and make sure that they were okay. And the practical details of how this happened is David had 16 risk experts in the other facet, the different facets of risk that worked for him. And that they would each have to sign off on every project from their particular perspective risk area. Okay? When David showed up, oops, sorry, I almost lost the punchline there. When David showed up, the average time for an approval was 120 days. Okay? And the way the process basically worked is if you were a project manager, what you had to do is you had to chase 16 different people, right, to get a meeting with them, to have them review your project and sign off. Okay, so this would create dozens, if not hundreds of emails, lots of time delays, and just lots of wasted time as you're trying to set up these meetings with 16 different people. And in many cases, you'd create a lot of iteration because one risk expert would say, well, this is not appropriate, you need to make a change. You'd make that change, but then you got to go through the other 15 people to make sure that that change is now appropriate. Okay? And you can see David's big insight there. He said, I realized the process was gated by the risk manager who thought it was the least important, right? Imagine I'm the cybersecurity risk manager, right? This particular project doesn't have any kind of cybersecurity risk footprint. Yeah, I'm not going to be in a huge hurry to meet with that project manager because I got other bigger risks that I'm supposed to deal with. Okay? Here was his intervention. Okay? He created a weekly 1-hour meeting with the 16 risk experts. Now, there's an interesting caveat to that I'll come back to. And the meeting was guided by something he called a common backlog, okay? Which is just a flip chart that has all the projects that they are supposed to be approving rank ordered. This is the most important. This is the second most important. This is the third most important. And in that meeting for that week, they would work on the top project until either it was done or they realized that there was data they needed that was not in the room, and then would kind of go in the parking lot and come back next week. That was it. Okay, we're just going to work on the first one until it's done. Then we're going to go to the next one. Okay, you can see the results, right? The average approval time fell from 120 days to 20, and by Standard Charter's own metrics, right, that reduction in cycle time saved the bank $250 million annually just by getting the projects to the customers that much faster.
In my experience, organizations are pretty terrible at stopping or ending work, programs, initiatives, projects. And I see that as a contributor to this overload. Do you have any insight into how organizations can be better at recognizing when it's time to pull the plug on something? You know, this is the usual human instinct toward escalation of commitment, honoring sunk costs, all the things that we teach in behavioral economics and classes. What's your sense?
Yeah, it's such a super question. And I think this is the reason that for the 20 years I told people to just do less stuff that didn't work, because they would dutifully kill projects. But it turns out what I have seen in many companies is that when you kill a project, it doesn't actually fully die. And it becomes like a kind of B zombie movie where you have these kind of half-dead projects that roam the hallways. And the problem is they consume resources, right? Because yeah, I'm working on my pet project a little bit. Yeah, you canceled it, but I know you're wrong. And so I'm going to sneak some resources, and it's on a spreadsheet somewhere. So someone has to keep track of it. And there's an administrator associated with it. And so I think, you know, getting rid of zombie projects is really, really hard. In the book, one of our lead users for dynamic work design, who really were our partners in developing it, is the Broad Institute. It's across the street from our offices at MIT. They're the world's leader in gene sequencing that grew out of the Human Genome Project. And it's a very rapidly moving industry. So they are always doing an enormous portfolio of technology development projects. And they used to talk about the underboard. And the underboard was all the projects that people were secretly working on that weren't on the board with the Post-its. And this is why I think the way to do that is, rather than try to get people to stop that, is to do the rank ordering, right? And have that difficult meeting where, like, okay, this is the number one most important thing we're going to do this quarter. This is number two. And what you will see, at least our empirical experience has been, is the zombie projects are always ranked 13th or 22nd or 30th. And if you go a year where your project's on the list at 30, finally people will get around to the idea that, you know, even though it's a good idea, it's not as good as the other ones. Because I think trying to tell someone who came up with an idea like, you just can't work on this, particularly for, you know, knowledge workers who are used to some degree of autonomy, I think is just very hard. Yeah. Now, again, that rank ordering meeting is not easy. I think it is easier than trying to kill off totally a project, even though I think, you know, hopefully they have the same effect when you're done.